Welcome to the 775 Alive podcast, your rural Nevada headquarters for decoding politics, economics, and general global shenanigans. I'm Crystal Newton, your business strategist, breaking down why Nevada's hustle is stronger than a sagebrush root in a windstorm. Here with my trusty co-host, Scott Gaborski, PhD historian, here to explain the smart lessons of history, even if we are likely to ignore them. Grab your boots for a wild ride through today's most important news.
Welcome back to 775 Alive. I'm flying solo today. Crystal had something come up and she couldn't join us, but I'm so happy to be joined here with Adam Swart from Crowds on Demand. Welcome, Adam.
Hey, Scott. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with the amazing people of all of Nevada. And we were just talking about it. Nevada is more than Vegas and Reno. So hello to the people of Elko and beyond.
Well, thank you. We asked Adam here to join us because Crowds on Demand, which he'll tell you about here in a minute, is a company that was set up basically to provide crowds for various events. And of course, one of the things we have going on right now nationwide, and Crystal and I have talked about this in a couple different episodes, both on protesting culture and when we did the interview with Ty Trowen, the retired police chief here in Elko, is this question about how legitimate this sort of paid protesting is. So Adam, go ahead and start this out. Give us a bit of your background and tell us what Crowds on Demand actually does.
Yeah, sure. So first off, founder and CEO of Crowds on Demand, we are the largest protest company in the country. We've been around for 13 years since 2012. Now, how are we around for 13 years? Well, the answer is that we don't do illegal forms of protest. So one of the number one things I have to correct the record on, and that's part of why I'm on this podcast and others, is to correct the record. There's so much misinformation that suggests that we have anything to do with riots, vandalism, looting, violence, blocking streets without a permit. That's not what we do. We are in the business of persuasive advocacy. We compensate demonstrators, yes, but we compensate passionate, enthusiastic activists to come out, speak on issues that they're passionate about and that work with what the client needs. And we do that around the country. And my focus is on respectful, persuasive advocacy, not just because blocking roads and vandalism and all that is illegal, but because ultimately those tactics aren't even effective. Those tactics are generally self-defeating. So my take is my style works, and that is why I'm here to talk a little bit about that and a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff there because you hit a lot of big stuff. And of course, most of the viewers know that I do a lot of public outreach consulting, particularly for rural and tribal audiences. In some of these cases, these quote unquote crowd hiring sources, well known within the industry, I've never had an opportunity to use them because I'm not doing that type of stuff. But if you have, say, for instance, a kickoff event, a movie premiere, a candidacy campaign kickoff, that's where these really got started and sort of their bread and butter. Am I correct? Just sort of filling seats so you look like you have a full crowd.
Well, that's true. And the way that I look at it is what you really are trying to do is give the right context to the event. As I always say, imagine the greatest speeches of all time. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech delivered to 5 people. It wouldn't have had the same resonance, right? Even though his words were the exact same. But if there were 5 people instead of 1 million people watching, it wouldn't have had that same resonance. So part of it is you want to put what you're doing in the right context. And some people say that's misleading. And here's why I don't think it's misleading. Everybody wants to put their right spin on what they're doing. It's why women put on makeup, right? They want to look their best versions of themselves. They're not trying to look like a different person. They want to look like their best person. It's why men shave or they groom, right? We want to look like the best versions of ourselves, right? Is that misleading? I guess certain people might think that, but overall, I think presenting well is a good thing. I had this interesting discussion with some gentlemen who also own a hard seltzer line. And I asked them, they said, oh, well, this is misleading. And I said, well, why don't you put a fat guy who lives in his mom's basement on the cover of your seltzer instead of a girl in a bikini? And they said, well, it wouldn't sell very well. I said, well, yeah, because you want the right context on your product. Well, I think that people should want that on their campaigns as well. So when you're doing a campaign launch, you want certain type of people. And by the way, even if you don't directly compensate them, I want to let your viewers know that every campaign does this. Every campaign does this, Republican, Democrat, or no party. I've worked on enough campaigns to know the people standing behind the candidate is it's a staged bunch of people. Oh, you want to have certain diversity there, or maybe you don't want diversity, but it's thought through. Maybe you want a labor union activist, or maybe you want a tribal activist, or whatever the case may be. You choose who is standing behind you and who is standing around you for a specific reason. So that's not misleading. That's just basic common sense.
Mm-hmm. And basic marketing. But that does get into the point that there's two dimensions. First of all, we've seen, probably over the last 10, 15 years, the rise of the term astroturf. That these aren't grassroots movements that are starting from the bottom up with that implication. They're organic, they're natural, they're being manufactured like you'd manufacture astroturf, for a playing field. What's your impression of that term? Is it legitimate or not?
I think it's kind of a juvenile term. Like, it feels like something a 7-year-old would say, like, he's cheating, he's cheating. It's like when in the reality of the fact is that astroturf is just a term that people come up with to tar people that they don't like. Right? Because the reality is both liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, whatever, have a ton of money behind them. So this concept of, oh, well, our movement is 100% genuine and no ulterior motives in their movement. Oh, that they're just there because they're being paid. It's kind of an absurd concept when every movement from MAGA to Tea Party to civil rights to gay rights has a ton of money behind it. So, like, let's not pretend that all the movements that you like and all the movements that you don't like have money behind them.
Mm-hmm. And, in some ways, I think what we're talking about here is perception. You're creating a perception that there's a groundswell, that there's a mob behind you. And sort of going off this, of course, we talked a bit here before the podcast, and why I brought up the fact that I'm trained as a historian. We've had this thing going around on the political left that, once you have 3.5% of the population out protesting, no government's ever survived that in history. And part of my problem is, one, how do you estimate the size of crowds, which is very difficult to begin with.
Also juvenile. It's just more juvenile antics from it. And now I have to be candid with you that President Trump also makes a big deal of crowd size. So this isn't solely a thing on the left. In fact, Trump is the first person I remember specifically making there's 100,000 in the crowd versus 50,000. Generally you'd have a president or a leader saying, oh, well, there's a lot of people in the crowd. Trump is basically no, it's not 50,000, it's 100,000, and you better say it's 100,000. So I think in fairness, you definitely have both people on the right and the left making a big deal of crowd size. And I've always been a believer that actually this is way overblown, even though it maybe profits me to say that it isn't. To me, I'm it doesn't really matter. I mean, you're a historian, so let's talk about the silent majority of the late 60s, right? So Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, right, correctly, they were talking about one of the things that they did was actually they called the left's bluff. So they said, okay, there are all these people. Maybe it was 3%. I don't know specifically how many were in the streets. But basically, Nixon and Agnew were saying, okay, those people are out there, but they don't reflect the broader sentiment. The broader sentiment doesn't necessarily support what they're saying. So I'm going to appeal to the people who aren't in the streets. And they won, right? They won in 68 and they won in 72 based on the people who weren't in the streets, right? So and here's a more modern example of, I'm sure you guys know, your listeners know of the Squad, the Squad, the far left in Congress, right? So 2 of their members got primaried, right? So these were far left members who got primaried by moderate Democrats, right? Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. So Jamal Bowman was New York, just up from New York City, and Cori Bush was St. Louis. And they both had however many millions of social media followers, and the people that they lost to had a couple thousand social media followers. So it really goes to show, yes, crowd size matters. Yes, social media matters. Of course it does. But what also matters is really knowing your area and knowing the people and being responsive. And if you live in a district where people are really politically active, actually that sometimes matters more than the crowd size. So yeah, 3.5% is a lot of people to draw into the street. Don't get me wrong, paid or unpaid, because paid if it's expensive, but the reality is that what matters more is are those why does it matter if the 3% is the idea is if 3% are in the streets, then 70% are in support of them. But I don't necessarily believe that that's always the case, right? Just because 3% in the streets means 3% in the streets. We've worked on so many city council, board of supervisors, whatever kind of meetings where, 80% of the people support our position, right? But of the 20%, those are the people who always show up. So we actually get hired to represent the silent majority, if you see what I'm saying.
Right, and that brings up an interesting point. I mean, there's a lot here to unpack. First of all, I think it's very interesting that you set up Crowds on Demand well before even Trump announces his presidency in 2015. Right, so this is already something that exists, and again, I've come across it and familiar with the concept from my work in the field. So this isn't something that's just new. This isn't something that's been created since 2016. But I think the other side of this is on one side you have the crowd size and the compensation or composition of that crowd, as you pointed out. But there's also the perception that carries. And I think that's part of where that astroturf comes from, is that this somehow isn't real. Okay. And we're seeing a lot of this now. A couple of weeks ago, when the Venezuelan situation sort of popped up, and all of a sudden within hours, there's the same posters across the country just sort of ready to go. What was your take on that?
Well, look, I think when it comes to I just want to make one point is I don't condone foreign governments, and I think in many cases it's illegal. To the extent that a foreign government was involved in those protests, which I cannot prove, but to the extent that it was, that's a problem, right? Because I believe it's illegal for foreign countries to involve themselves in our domestic affairs, right? So to the extent that of course we involve ourselves in other countries' domestic affairs all the time, but
right,
we're America. We do what we want. I'm saying that with such a serious face, like how dare they involve themselves in our domestic affairs, and we do it all the time. But whatever, we're America. We got the aircraft carriers, right? So anyway, okay, whatever. So I have a problem with that. But there's also, even to the extent that maybe it wasn't a foreign country, yeah, of course, there's organization behind it. I mean, but my question is, isn't it like, do you think that the people who are demonstrating don't care? Or is your point that there's a lot of money behind the movement, right? Because those are two sort of separate questions. Like both can be true at the same time. MAGA has a ton of money behind it, but a lot of people really support MAGA. So could it not also be true that Palestine or Venezuela or whatever the causes are, agree or disagree, may have a lot of legitimate support while also having money behind them, right? Like, I think those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and that's something that came up because well, first of all, one of the things that strikes me is, of course, marketing 101 for anything, and this is a form of marketing, consistency of message. Yeah. Get your message, hit it, hammer it, hammer it, hammer it. And that's part of what I think we're seeing with these signs and whatnot is the messaging. But one of the things that I found that was very interesting back last spring, when the No Kings protest broke out across the country. And Crystal and I talked about that extensively because Crystal actually got caught in the crowd that was protesting in Carson City. And of course, we've had a couple since then. But one of the things that got me about at least the initial, and I would say still the last series of No Kings protests, is there really was no unity in the messaging. I mean, you'd go up there and there's 30, 40, 50 different signs that are going in sort of different directions about what Trump's doing.
So, Scott, I guess here's my question. It does feel like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you're criticizing the Venezuela thing because you're saying, oh, well, they have all the same signs, right? And now it seems like you're leveling the opposite criticism at the No Kings and saying, Oh, they have different signs, right? So is there a common thread to that criticism, or is this a more of a curiosity?
Well, no, it's partially a curiosity, and I think it gets to it because I tend to see the No Kings protest as having been a little bit more organic, right? Particularly when it started, simply because there is no messaging outside the fact we don't like Trump, and here's the specific
Of
reasons.
course, yeah.
I actually have, and again, you haven't seen the entire episode. Crystal and I, this was one of our biggest arguments that relates directly to this, and why we were excited to get you on the show.
Of course.
Is I actually don't think there's anything wrong or necessarily illegal or immoral with paid protest. I have no problem with that, right? It happens, and when Crystal and I were talking about it, because Crystal at times pointed, isn't there something we should be doing? Because is this really an exercise of free speech? Well, it is. It doesn't matter if you get
It's
paid.
no different than buying an advertisement.
Right. And I think that's the true. But I pointed out labor unions have done this for years. Even if they're out on strike, they're paying the people to protest. You're absolutely. I agree with you totally. It's not mutually exclusive. Somebody can be holding a pre-printed sign and still believe in the message on that sign.
Exactly.
Right? Because that's advertising.
It's advertising, and people can there can be money and there can be legitimate support. Now, the one of the challenges, so it's a really interesting thing, because just get into a little bit of strategy for a movement, is there is this balance of hey, you have what you're describing with that is, okay, there could be a coalition where you have maybe some people who are mad at Trump about Palestine, and maybe some people who are mad at him about healthcare and whatever. So the challenge is that if your message is too all over the place, then it really runs the risk of being lost.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's too focused, then it's harder to get a broader support base behind it, right? So one great example of the former is Occupy Wall Street. I mean, if you think about it, that Occupy Wall Street was one of the greatest failures in American political history, right? And let me describe why it was one of the greatest failures. So this was 2009, right? We've had the financial crash, right? People had lost everything. Unemployment highest since the 20s, right? Or since the Great Depression, right? America was in a terrible place, and people were mad, and people were saying what is going on with Wall Street, right? They had it seemed like these executives were getting away with everything. You had Obama, right, who was kind of elected on a principle of reform, but so if you think about it, this movement, they had 66 Democratic senators, I think it was. They had presidency. They had, almost super majority with Pelosi in the House, right? The fact that they did not get any accountability for Wall Street, right? They were not able to get any reforms in for Wall Street. All those Wall Street people walked. No one really went to jail of the high level people who were responsible for things, right? So the fact that it was such a patent failure, despite so many hundreds of thousands of people coming out, was actually a sign that they didn't have specific messaging. If they had said, Mr. President, we are demanding XYZ. We are demanding, number one, that the Department of Justice create this task force. Number two, that you subpoena these executives and you claw back their pay, or you don't bail out these companies. Number three, right? Whatever the agenda was, and said, look, we are demanding this. But what you do, one of the big things if in advocacy is you don't give the elected officials opportunity to give you lip service, right? Because what any elected official, Republican or Democrat, is always looking to do is yes, I agree with you. You are right, and I'm with you, while actually not doing anything for you. Right? Because they don't want to do anything for you, because generally what they want is to support the side of the big interests, right? Because that's who's paying the bills. So if they can give you lip service without consequential action, which is exactly what the Democratic politicians did during the Occupy movement, they yelled at the Wall Street CEOs, they yelled at the car company CEOs, but they didn't do anything, right? And that's because Occupy Wall Street had no cohesive management that basically said, we're demanding this and we're not going to let you off the hook until you do it. You see what I'm saying? So
Right.
so whereas there is this beauty in like, oh, there's 50 different signs and there's there's the libertarian guy, there's the abortion guy, there's the Palestine guy. Well, okay, what are you going to accomplish from that, right? Like, everybody knows there are a lot of people who don't like Trump. I mean, however many million people voted against Donald Trump, right? So we all know that there are people who don't like Trump. The question is, if you're on the other side of Trump, what are you consequentially going to do to rein in his agenda?
Well, and I think this gets to an interesting point. I'm glad you brought up Occupy Wall Street. I got plenty of stories about about Occupy Wall Street, but because I think and with the No King, so you have two protests that really didn't have the high focus, and I would argue failed. I'm not really sure the No King's protest actually accomplished anything other than some highlight footage for the media and keep people engaged.
I'll give you one thing on No King's. It's a psychological thing for the people on the left, right? And I'm not saying that like as an insult, just to be clear, but like, a lot of people on the left feel very dispirited right now. And there is some value to the extent that you're doing it peacefully, which I think it was, right? Of coming together with other people who believe the same things you believe. Now, it doesn't matter so much in a place like San Francisco or New York or Boston, right? Where people are liberal. But if you're in a place like Carson City or you're in a place like Elko or wherever, right? Where that are more Trump country, there is I think, psychological value of coming together with people who feel that way, the same way as you. But yes, correct. On a policy matter, it was a complete failure. They achieved nothing.
Mm-hmm. Do you include the Tea Party in with that?
Oh, 100. Well, the Tea Party, no, because so here's the thing: the Tea Party was very effective, but you remember that guess who funded the Tea Party? The Koch brothers, right? Mm-hmm. So the Koch brothers, the Tea Party before the Koch brothers created it when it basically, remember, it was like 20 guys with the tricolor hats dressed like, Washington and Thomas Jefferson, right? And, Fox News and the conservative media really amplified it, and then it grew, right? But the Koch brothers and other conservative billionaires bankrolled the Tea Party from the get-go, is my understanding. And if the Koch brothers want to dispute that, feel free. But it was, I had this argument with Lawrence Jones of Fox News about this, and he was like, no, the Tea Party wasn't funded. It's like, dude, like, it was like, it's on the records, right? It was a very, very well-funded movement.
Right.
Again, that's not to take away from the fact that people believed in the movement. So again, what my point is, which I keep saying, is something can be well-funded and have people who believe in it. In fact, what the funding does is it catalyzes a movement. So there are a lot of amazing movements that die in darkness because no one ever hears about them. So if you're saying, hey, I'm going to fund this, like, what is the Tea Party? It was anti-tax, anti-big government, and basically says, we're going to fund this because we feel like the Obama administration is overreaching, right? And a lot of people agree with that, but you first have to market that message so that people listen to it, right? And they did, and it resonated, right? Conversely, money does not buy success. I mean, there's a gentleman, I'm not sure you remember him. He ran for president in 2016. His name is Jeb Bush.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard of him?
Yeah, low energy Jeb.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of like so obscure at this point. I'm like, I even wonder if anyone's heard of him. But yeah, he had like a couple $100 million of funding, and it was just a total disaster. And everybody knew who he was at the time. But or like Michael Bloomberg, right, on the other side. Like, money does not buy support. What money does is it makes sure that people can pay attention to your message and hear your message. And then from that point, the movement has to fly. So it's like, okay, you can get the bird off the ground, but the bird still has to have wings.
Right. And of course, the Harris campaign in 2024 is the great example.
Another great example of that.
Yeah, billions of dollars.
If I just wrote on the ballot, instead of Kamala Harris, right, John Smith, Democrat, right? That John Smith, Democrat. I've never heard of John Smith, but John Smith would have gotten more votes than Kamala Harris, right? A person you've never heard of who didn't spend $1. They literally would have gotten more votes just because their name was Democrat, and it was not Donald Trump, right? Like everyone who voted for Kamala Harris would have voted for any other person other than Donald Trump, is my
Mhm.
understanding.
Well,
I
and
mean,
that's
Kamala is just. I mean, that was so embarrassing. That was truly an embarrassing campaign. Um, that was truly an embarrassing campaign. I mean, Biden never should have. He should have either stepped down before this whole thing, like after the midterms, or just not at all. I mean, but it was just a total disaster. Kamala was, I mean, that was a joke. But I'm from California, so I know Kamala. I mean, I remember when she was at my dorm room, at UCLA. She used to come to campaign at UCLA, and like there were like three people listening to her. And I remember she was really mad. I mean, I was working in Democratic Party politics at the time. I'm an independent now, but at the time, I remember she would always be mad. This was part of the inspiration for starting this business. Is when I was a volunteer, and she'd get so mad, and all these people would like because you'd go and like no one would come to hear. I mean, she was always a master at the behind the scenes, but she was never very good at having support. I mean, she never really had a ton of support when she ran her own presidential campaign into the 2019-20 primary season.
right.
And interestingly enough, the group that she did worse with is the black voters, I think. She did
Right.
worse with the black voters who she's kind of marketed herself as that, but she actually did not do very well with that group. I think she did the best with the well-to-do white women.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about that because we've been talking about a series of failures, some successes, but failures in messaging for whatever reason, whether it be
Yeah,
crowd size, whether it be messaging.
yeah,
Um, but I think part of what we're seeing now that has brought this topic of paid for crowds up to the point is that the failure of some of these movements, like No Kings and other protests, now seems to be pushing these crowds in the direction of violence, right?
yeah.
That peaceful protest isn't working, but we're starting to get uncomfortably close. And I mean, as a historian, Americans have very little experience with political violence over the last
That's
two or
very
three
true.
generations. We just
Very,
don't have it. So a lot of this seems shocking.
yes.
Um, but I think that's an interesting messaging component in its own right that now what we're seeing, Minnesota comes to mind, some of these other protests where we really are seeing violence being engaged in, there's no way, shape, or form you can call some of these peaceful,
Not
right?
at all. Not at all. So a couple thoughts. Number one is even within the context of the American experience, these past 20 years have actually been the lowest in political violence, right? And
Hmm.
fortunately so. Like if you look at the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was actually a lot more. I mean, Dr. King, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, John Lennon, Harvey Milk, George Moscone, I mean, many others like lesser known people. So, I mean, you had an era of immense political violence during that time. And of course, I fear that with what you've seen in Minnesota now, of course, the horrible attack on Charlie Kirk, right? Like I fear that is happening now, that we are leading to that now. But I don't think it has to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. And I'll tell you why. We are so fortunate to live in a country that affords us the right of peaceful expression, right? Like, and I can tell you as this, like, the law gives us huge leeway in lawful protests. Like, we have done as part of the delete Facebook protest that was very successful, that even caused Facebook to change its name. Like they changed their name to Meta because we protested them. Like we were able to protest Mark Zuckerberg's estate. Like in what country can you protest an estate of one of the most powerful, richest people in the country? We can do that legally, right? We have so many rights legally in this country to protest. There is no excuse for violence and law breaking in a country that actually affords us those immense privileges. That's my opinion. Like I'm having done this for 13 years. I know, like a lot of people don't even understand, like the amount of protests that you are allowed to do. You can be on any sidewalk besides any, like you could literally, the law gives us the ability to protest almost any public place at almost any time, anywhere in the country on any subject, however offensive. So I'm like, I don't, it really upsets me when people take up any kind of law breaking and violence because we're so lucky in this country to have the ability to have such a wide breadth of what we're allowed to do in terms of public expression. And I support that, so that if people are doing these things like impeding federal officers, blocking roads, all that, that is completely inexcusable.
And that gets into, I think, part of the dynamic. And I'm one of the people who is sort of picky that there's not a specific right to protest in the Constitution. There's peacefully assemble, address.
Assembly, that's protest.
Right, right.
Assembly is
Well,
protest.
well, yes and no. I mean, because that same right could be
I
instituted
mean,
in
that's
the
been
town
affirmed by the
hall.
Supreme Court. Yeah, but that's been affirmed by the Supreme Court many, many times. Assembly equals protest. I mean, assembly. I mean, of course, to me, assembly. It's obviously and indicates that you have the right to protest. Now, of course, there are certain jurisdictions that no jurisdictions have the right to limit how you protest. For example, most jurisdictions have limits on what's called amplified sound. That's like you can't blare a megaphone at 2 a.m., right? Because that is generally considered like beyond assembly, right? That's more of a
Mhm.
nuisance. Now, if you want to use a megaphone, you can get a permit and have your time to do that. If you want to you block a street, you can get a permit and have your time to do that. But overall, assembly generally means people on a public area, gathered chanting with their own voices.
Right. Well, and that's part of why I bring this up because I find it interesting. Part of it is what's the meaning of protesting, right? If it's just saying no, I would agree with you 100%. But I'm thinking of an argument that I think is developing very strongly that once you hit some sort of moral event horizon, right, that justifies actions that wouldn't be acceptable. For instance, if you're just, celebrating a sports team winning, right, or something else. And I think we're starting to see that argument become more and more embedded, right?
And the
That
argument meaning you're referring to the argument among some far left protesters that violence is acceptable.
right, right.
And that
That
I
if the
and I just want to completely condemn that. So I just want I
right,
can't condemn that more like enough. Whether it's I don't care if it's from the right or the left because what I don't want any kind of like the vigilantism or anything like that. So I condemn that in the strongest possible terms. I think that like if you want to work through the psychology of why people think that, like there's a few reasons. Number one is I think there are some people who are just psychologically like delusional, right? Who have like social media is a cancer in this country. And social media, I'm sure you know, and I know people who have just lost their minds both on the right and on the left who've just gone down a rabbit hole and never come back. And
hmm
I started noticing that rabbit hole in 2015, 16, and it's just gotten deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And it's gone down to a hole in the center of the earth, next to Satan himself, in my opinion. Like the social media companies are satanic, in my opinion, truly. Because they are basically using all of your darkest, deepest, darkest emotions because that's what keeps you on the platform. And the longer you're on the platform, the more money they make on you because the more they can sell you shit, right? So, pardon my French.
no,
But so what they are doing is patently evil, in my opinion. And social media has radicalized people on the right and it has radicalized people on the left. And there are some people who've been so radicalized on the left that they believe that some of these actions are acceptable. Number one. Number two, I think that there is actually a misinterpretation of what the law allows you and does not allow you to do. So I saw this video on Twitter yesterday of this woman who I guess was blocking the ICE vehicles, and the ICE is like, okay, we're going to refer you to the prosecution. And she was like, please, please don't. I'm a mom. I'm a mom. I didn't know, like I'm a mom. And I guess they let her go. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is that is not protest. You can stand on the public street with a sign. You can say F ICE. You have a lot of leeway in what you can demonstrate, but you cannot basically block in a police vehicle to try to impede them from doing their job, right? That is not an acceptable form of protest. But I think a lot of people don't understand the legal of that. So I think I would just urge people to make sure that you understand that that is not a permissible form of protest, right? That you can stand with a sign, you can even yell at ICE officers if you want, though I don't condone that. Um, um, but I think that you can certainly hold your signs and everything. But so I think part of it is that. But I think that the psychology does have the roots in the social media, and I really could not condemn these social media companies more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and let's go back, because might be a good place to go back to this topic you raised earlier of the catalyzation provided by funding into these. And of course, you've been doing a tour on a number of the talk shows about where some of this funding for these violent protests are coming from. What have you been seeing in that?
Well, it's very concerning because number one, so why do I think there's money behind it? As I've worked through before, tactical gear, very expensive, right? Very expensive. So there's videos of tactical gear being distributed on the streets of Los Angeles, right? And it looks like they have like hundreds of units, right? So someone's out there with spending all that money on tactical gear, right? Now, of course, I don't believe it's illegal to wear tactical gear, but generally the reason you wear tactical gear is because you're prepared for a fight, right? So it's not inherently illegal, but it seems to be associated with you're trying to escalate a situation, right? My focus actually is de-escalation. I always try to de-escalate because I always try to say, and that's part of why people use us, is that we're persuasive advocates. Yes, people aren't always happy to see protesters, of course, but my goal is to always de-escalate a situation. So, okay, number two, you had bricks being distributed, right? You also had, I mean, this is a little bit further back, but you had like all these tents that all were the same color, that all looked like the same brand, that were being distributed for an illegal encampment on certain college campuses, right? It's illegal to just camp on a college campus without a permission for that. So that I consider that an illegal activity, right? So yeah, I mean, even though it's not necessarily violent, but I do consider it somewhat violent if you're basically having these checkpoints, as these students did, and saying only certain ethnicities of people are allowed to go past the checkpoints. I mean that's ridiculous, of course. Presumably with the or else being that if someone does try to check it, push through the checkpoint, that there would be violence. So to me, that feels like threatening. So I guess the way that I would look at it is that, yeah, there's money behind it, and that needs to be investigated, which is why, by the way, to get to something I wanted to talk about, which is that I have put forward, and I've written to Congress and supported what's called a Transparency in Political Demonstrations Act, which requires any demonstration with over 500 participants involved, right? So that's a large demonstration, to disclose the funding and the vendors, right? So, and we want to go to the source of the funding and distort the source of the vendors, right? So whether it's a labor union, whether it's government, whether it's whoever is involved in this, we want to know, right? And who's funding it and who is receiving compensation. And by the way, compensation refers to in-kind compensation. So a labor union member who's getting a preferential shift, or someone who's a political staffer who's going, that it needs to be disclosed too. And what that will do is give people the transparency. Now, a lot of people are asking, Adam, why are you supporting this, right? You would think that I would be opposing it. Well, the reason why I support it is there's so much misinformation about our involvement, and that I have nothing to hide. But what I want is for everyone to be subject to the same disclosure standards, and we are enthusiastic to get this passed, and we will comply just like everyone else will.
And let me just play devil's advocate on that, because how you described that brought up a sort of a parallel situation we've had recently with the effort to force public disclosure of funders of ballot initiatives.
Yeah.
In many states, right? California, the Proposition 8 a number of years ago. This was really the big issue. And a lot of people found that unsavory, because what they said is that will chill free exercise of this stuff. Do you think the Transparency in Protesting Act is that something that might chill the willingness of groups to potentially fund a protest?
Well, I want to be clear that this is only for large scale protests. So if you have 50 people or 100 people, my goal is not to make it overly burdensome for people to comply, but it's more to say what I am looking to do is to say, look, if you have these really large demonstrations, people should understand what all is behind it. And part of it is actually it's going to help because people will understand, okay, this is what is behind it. So it'll actually take away some of the conspiracy element to it. Yeah, I mean, this is a balance. It is a legitimate point, and I do generally support anonymous free speech. We have facilitated anonymous free speech. A lot of your Republican listeners may not realize that we've worked with a lot of Republican customers, especially in the Biden administration, who were petrified about cancel culture. So they're CEOs, board members, all these type of people, right, who are like, hey, if it ever comes out I'm funding a Republican cause, this is going to be really bad for me. So we are the vehicle for that, right? So I understand the concern, and it's a legitimate concern, and it has to be balanced. But I think there's just so much misinformation and disinformation about these protests that I do think that having some degree of transparency, and I'm open to negotiating the degree of transparency to facilitate anonymous US donors who want to be a part of it, but the biggest thing is I want to wean out any foreign interference, and I want to understand that who is being paid around these events.
Right. And that's something that came out. I mean, there's just been a recent discussion. I think there's only like 8 states, for instance, that have laws specifically banning foreign actors from contributing funds to ballot initiatives. So in 42 states in the union, a foreign power can come in and fund a ballot initiative, right? They can't give the candidates, but they can fund a ballot initiative. And do you think from some of your research that this foreign investment is really a major deal that we've seen maybe ramp up here over the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I believe that it is a long running issue where I mean, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, many foreign countries naturally want to exert influence in the United States, right? We know that. So, and as America becomes more powerful, which we have, it makes sense that countries do want to do that, but there is a legal process to do that, and it involves registering with foreign agents and stuff. So there are legal ways for foreign countries to advocate within the United States and hire, and within the context of even organizing demonstrations, but there has to be disclosures of that, right? But this is kind of an extension of that to say, look, we really want to understand what is going on with all of this, the protest stuff, and that is to be expected.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough topic, and I my thinking, and again, this is the historian, is we're probably at the beginning of an uptick in violence for a period, right? I don't think it's going to get as bad as the 60s or 70s, but I think it is going to catch a lot of Americans off guard.
Well, you know why I think that I hope you're wrong, and let me tell you why I think you could be wrong.
Well, I hope I'm wrong too, but go ahead.
Well, the internet is interesting, right? So I was just lamenting that social media companies are evil, etc. I stand by that. But one interesting thing about social media, about the ability to participate online with the forums, is it does give people an opportunity to vent without violence. So I do wonder the extent to which, if these people in the 60s, 70s, 80s who perpetrated acts of violence had access to just vent online and say horrible, depraved things online, whether they might have avoided actually doing violence, if you see what I'm saying. Like, I wonder if being online is kind of like a vehicle for that, or these video games or whatever. Like, people say, oh, video games make people violent, but I wonder sometimes if video games are actually like a release for violence. So I don't know, but I think that I think people are really like, a lot of people, like, one of the effective things about protest these days, people ask, oh, well, what's the value of protest in this, like, age of internet and digital and AI? Well, actually, it's because people aren't expecting it so much. Is that, like,
Right.
there's so little in person that when there's actually is something in person, it actually has more attention than it used to. And the same goes, like, I think, yeah, so I think that's the value of protest.
Right. And it's interesting because I would have argued that one of the reasons the US has had, a remarkably for a country 250 years old, we've had remarkably little political violence. And I would argue part of the reason is stuff like the freedom of speech, assembly and whatnot actually allows that to vent. I mean, one of the things people complain about in American politics, everybody's screaming about everything. Well, but that keeps issues from blowing up, right? It's a release valve, right? That's interesting to see the internet in that way. We'll have to see how this works. It's going to be an interesting debate. So, no, I've really enjoyed this, Adam. I appreciate you being out here. If somebody wants to find out more about Crowds on Demand or the, let me get this right because I've been mumbling this up all day, Transparency and Political Demonstration Act you're sponsoring, where can they go to find this information?
Crowdsondemand.com. Crowdsondemand.com.
Okay, and that will link over to the transparency.
Or you can follow me on Twitter at CEO Adam Swart. I don't post that much, but if you wanna support it, then let me know. Send me a DM on Twitter or something.
Okay. Well, this has been really good. Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. This is going to be an issue I think that's going to be continuing to come up. If you out there have a question, of course, Adam just gave you his contact information. If you want to reach Crystal and I, go ahead and shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. Until then, we'll see you around the 775.